everyone. Welcome to today's session, Navigating the Archives. This is in anticipation of our in-person archive session next week. So if you're planning on going to the in-person session, you have until Monday at the close of business, which is 5 p.m. to register. Okay. So as always, I am your host. My name is Janie Adams. I'm the Curator of Education for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm a staff historian, and I am the Arizona Affiliate National History Day Coordinator based out of Tucson, Arizona. Also joining us today is Allison Avery, also Curator of Education, and Allison is going to be the Regional Coordinator for the Central Arizona National History Day Contest. So that's your East Valley, West Valley, Phoenix area contest. Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of review before we jump into thinking about actually getting into the archives. So what is the difference between a primary and a secondary source? Sometimes I think students get a little confused and they say, oh, a primary source is my most important source. And while your primary sources will be your most important sources, they are not necessarily one and the same. So a primary source is a source that has direct connections to the people or events that you're studying. It is created at the same time as the event of study. So on the other hand, a secondary source is a removed account of people or events or materials related to or created to comment or understand an idea or event. So basically, primary sources are your evidence from that historical event or relating to that historical event, because sometimes they're interviews taken 20 years in the future, still primary sources, still about that event, not from the same time. Important distinction. So your primary sources are going to be your pieces of evidence, and your secondary sources are going to be how all of those pieces of evidence connect to each other and how we derive meaning from those pieces of evidence, right? So the secondary source is the interpretation of primary source materials. So if you attended one of our earlier workshops, you've seen these examples. So this is just a refresher. So thinking about what kind of a source is a book written about Pearl Harbor in 1975? That's going to be a secondary source. What about a letter from Thomas Jefferson to his friend? That's going to be a primary source, right? That is from the time period or person or event of study. What about an interview with an activist at a protest? That's also going to be a primary source, right? It's happening in the moment. It's unedited, it's raw, it's happening at that time. An article from a peer-reviewed journal. Don't worry, we'll talk about peer-reviewed. If you don't know what that means, we'll get to it. But an article from a peer-reviewed journal is going to be a secondary source. What about a dress? Sometimes I think we forget about three-dimensional objects, but three-dimensional objects, artifacts, those are going to be primary sources. And when we have our primary source workshop later in October, I will present different ways of how you can actually analyze three-dimensional objects. What about a textbook? So I think everyone's knee-jerk reaction is that a textbook is a secondary source, but that's not always the case. So let's talk a little bit about when primary sources are not primary sources. So we can't assume that a source is of a source category just because it's a particular kind of source. So what do I mean by that? It's important that when we approach a source, a piece of material, a piece of evidence, that we read it and we think about how it will connect to our project instead of assuming that a newspaper article is always a primary source, for example. So here are some instances where we need to be careful about categorizing sources. Remember, we just talked about textbooks. So if you're writing a history of history education, a textbook might be a primary source in that case because you're citing it as evidence for how history was taught in the past. An op-ed piece in a newspaper, very different from a headline article, very different from a kind of synthesis of 25 years of reporting. All of those things are really different, and that will dictate how they are perceived, primary source, secondary source. And then a quick note about interviews. Only the raw interview data is a primary source. Any editing that you make to that transcript adds your interpretation to what your informant or your interviewee said. And when you do that, it is no longer a primary source because you've tampered with it. That also goes against the ethics of doing interviews. Typically, when you interview someone, you have to fill out a consent form, and then you have a conversation about the kinds of things that you will or won't ask, or the kinds of things that you will or won't publish. If you're interested in learning more about how to do an interview, you want to check out the How to Interview an Elder worksheet from the Arizona Historical Society Arizona Digital History Hub. Download it. It's a printable worksheet, and it'll walk you through how to do it. Okay. Another thing that I wanted to talk about primary sources in particular is objectivity. Okay, so we have things that are objective and we have things that are subjective, right? So objective tends to be more kind of facts-based, right? Whereas subjective is dependent on the viewer, the interpretation, the way that the wind blows. So a lot of us tend to think that primary sources are objective facts, and that's not always the case. So I wanted to share with you this photograph because I think that a lot of us have a tendency to believe that photographic evidence in particular is irrefutable. And so I wanted to have a conversation about photography technology and objective facts. So this photograph that I'm presenting for all of us is a photograph taken by C.S. Fly, who is a really famous Arizona photographer, famous for really two kind of major Arizona history events. One, the shootout at the OK Corral happened kind of next to C.S. Fly's photography studio. And then C.S. Fly is one of the only Americans to actually photograph Indigenous people at war against the United States. Kind of interesting approach. So these are photographs that C.S. Fly took at Geronimo's final surrender. And whenever I analyze a photograph, the first thing that I do is I just kind of look at it and I just absorb all of the objective materials of the photograph. So in this photograph, we see like 20 or so people. They're lined up, they're armed, there's someone mounted in the center of that line that suggests something about importance. Notice that all of the women are kind of pushed to the periphery of the photograph. It looks like it was taken outside. There's some like landscape going on. All of these people have a kind of non-Western, non-kind of Euro-American way of dress. So now we have kind of our general facts about the photograph. Okay, now I want to show you the piece of technology that this photograph was taken with. So this is C.S. Fly's camera. It's not the camera that took this image, but it's very similar. So what do we know about photography from the late 1800s? We know that it took a really long time to take pictures, right? Now when we take a photograph, boom, instant, a split second. In the past, you used to have to wait for the film to develop. So sometimes your camera's aperture would be open for 10, 15, 20 minutes trying to absorb all of the light to actually print the image onto the film, right? So now we know that this image was taken with this camera, and we know that this is a posed photograph. So now that we know that this is a posed photograph, how does it change the photograph's meaning? Right now we can see C.S. Fly, the artist, as C.S. Fly, the historical interpreter, right? C.S. Fly organized all of these people. C.S. Fly made the call that Geronimo would be mounted on a horse in the center of the photograph. He also made the call that all of the men would be holding guns, ready to shoot, even though this happened after Geronimo was arrested. C.S. Fly made the call to put the women on the edges of the photograph, right? So now that we know that, it changes the way that we observe the photograph. So I just want us to be really careful when we're looking at a photograph that we don't automatically assume that the photograph is an objective fact. Arguably, there is no such thing as an objective fact. There is evidence and interpretation of evidence. And those two things are not objective. Remember, we talked about bias, we talked about nuance, we talked about individual perspective. So all of those things you need to keep in mind when you're assessing any kind of primary source, photography in particular. Okay, digression over. So let's talk a little bit about who has worked. So when we're starting our online or when we're starting our research for primary and secondary sources, it can be a little overwhelming trying to determine who has what kinds of stuff, right? So let's look at 4 major buckets of where we can find sources, and we'll think a little bit about who has what and where it all belongs. So let's talk about libraries. So this could be the public library, this could be your school's library. Libraries are going to be a really great source for journals, or for academic journals, for books, and for newspapers. Sometimes libraries will have a special collection. So sometimes libraries will have material relating to a specific community or a specific event. Not always, but some libraries will have a special collection. So then we have museums, like the Arizona History Museum in Tucson. Museums are going to have 3-dimensional objects and the guides that support the understanding of those 3-dimensional objects. So that could be a dress and then an object catalog entry on how to read a dress, where the dress came from, how the museum procured it. All of that information is important for understanding why this piece is significant. Okay, so then we have archives and special collections. So these are going to be like the Arizona Historical Society libraries and archives. This could be the Charlotte Hall Library and Archive. This could be special collections at ASU. Special collections have primary source collections. They have rare books, and sometimes they have other secondary sources pertaining to the collection foci. Foci is how you properly pluralize the word focus. So foci, meaning that the collection has different things that it excels in, right? So maybe they have a lot of stuff on the Chicano movement. ASU has a really great Chicano collection in their special collections. So those will also have, or those kinds of repositories will have newspapers and journals pertaining to the topics on which they collect. So you're not going to find every kind of newspaper and journal in an archive or special collections, but you will find ones that relate to what they are interested in collecting. And then finally, we have online databases. So online databases like JSTOR, like Chronicling America are so diverse because there are so many of them. So these are going to have primary and secondary sources pertaining to the collection foci. So for example, Chronicling America is about newspapers. They have a ton of newspapers. They have them in a ton of different languages, from all the way from the 1600s. I think they actually have some really early ones from the 1600s all the way to today. So they have a huge collection, but it's all newspapers. JSTOR, on the other hand, is a repository for all kinds of different academic journals. So everything from the Journal of Arizona History to a really technical science journal, they will have in their collection. So it's really a matter of understanding what the collection foci is and then seeing if that relates to your topic, right? So if you're looking for newspapers, you want to go to Chronicling America. But maybe if you're not looking at newspapers, maybe part of your argument is that you're explicitly not examining newspapers. Chronicling America might not do you any good. So it's just a matter of kind of understanding what you need. Okay, where the heck do I even start? Start with your local librarian. Maybe that's the librarian at your school. Maybe that's reaching out to a librarian at your public library, or maybe that's reaching out to a librarian that partners with National History Day, like an AHS library or a librarian at Charlotte Hall. Archives and special collections may have a collecting focus, but librarians and archivists are also really great researchers, and they can help you figure out where to start. So just because the Arizona Historical Society focuses on Arizona history collections doesn't mean that our librarians won't be able to help you find stuff. In order to become a librarian, you have to have a certain level of training, and all librarians kind of get that same level of training. So because that's the case, all librarians are going to be able to help you do things like use WorldCat, access JSTOR, contact other libraries to see what kind of stuff that they have. So always start with a librarian. Another great place to start is by picking up a book. Try to find a book on your topic and look at the bibliography. What kind of sources did that author use? How is your interpretation of those sources different? So talk to a librarian, read a book. Two really great places to start with your research. So here's some contact information for National History Day and Arizona partner librarians. The Arizona Historical Society Reference Desk, AHS Reference at azhs.gov, or the Charlotte Hall Reference Desk, archives request at charlottehallmuseum.org. These are both really great resources. Like I said, any librarian is going to be able to help you at least get started with your research. So reach out. Okay, so finding aids and how to read them. So when you look at a collection, either on, maybe you can access the entire collection online, or maybe you can just access the finding guide. A lot of really big collections are going to have this thing called a finding aid. A finding aid is a painstakingly detailed document that helps you understand everything in a given collection. So you want to start by reading the finding aid first. It sucks when you get to the archive and you pull open a box and you're really excited to look at the stuff and you're like, this is not what I thought I was looking at. So always start by reading the finding aid. So let's look at some of these pieces here. So the biggest piece is going to be the archive, and that's going to be all of the pieces that they have in their collection. Archives have innumerable documents, like a crazy amount of documents. So we have to find a way to chunk them out into smaller pieces. And one of those smaller pieces is called a manuscript collection. So a manuscript collection is a specific subset of the larger collection. Maybe it's organized by a topic or relating to a person or an event. Then you have the box, which is an even smaller piece. And then you have the folder, which is an even smaller piece. So I want to show you this finding aid from the Arizona Historical Society for the Harold C. Gist papers. Harold Gist was a state legislator in the state of Arizona, and we have a lot of his papers at the Historical Society. And a lot of his papers pertain to the Equal Rights Amendment. So if you want to write your paper on the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment, we just digitized a bunch of letters sent to Senator Gist from Arizonans where they talk about whether or not they're in support of or against the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, so this is what a finding aid will look like. Notice how this finding aid has 69 individual boxes, and it is almost 34 feet long. That is a ton of material. So it's really important that you check out the finding aid before you get to the archive. And so this finding aid has information about who Gist was, how we got it, you know, if there's any restrictions on how you can use or access this collection. It's got a bibliographical note about Gist and who he was. It's got this note about scope and content, which will be really helpful if you're trying to find something very specific. And then it's got the actual breakdown of the boxes and folders. So notice that there are all these different boxes, and then there are folders, and the folders tell you what is in the box. So that's going to be all the way down. So if you were interested in Arizona State Hospitals, you would want to check out box number 5, folder 42. And a lot of finding aids are going to be organized this way. This is to help you, the researcher, get a better sense of what it is that you're trying to look at. Okay. Just a note that boxes and folders tend to be themed. We do like to categorize things. It helps us understand when there are patterns, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's an issue of space. So you'll see the same theme kind of carry over from box to box, or maybe you're looking at stuff and you'll think to yourself, this is better in this folder than this folder. There's a rhyme and a reason, I promise. It's just not that, it's not always that rhyme and reason is shared with the general archives goer. Okay, I cannot stress this enough. Take notes. Take notes. Very, 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 very important. Remember that if you're doing a National History Day project, you have to have an annotated bibliography. And it really sucks when you're trying to write your annotated bibliography the night before your project is due when you did research 6 months ago. Doesn't matter how you take your notes. Some of your teachers might want you to use the Cornell style. Some of your teachers might be a little loose with the rules that they have. Just check with your teacher, but take notes. So important. Take notes not only on what you found, but also your emotional state. I know that sounds a little silly, but I promise you it'll be super, super helpful. So here are some questions to think about when you're taking notes while doing archival research. How does this further my research? Or on the other hand, does this challenge my hypothesis? Does this challenge the idea that I had about what I was going to find? It's really important that if we find stuff that disagrees with our original thesis statement, that we just don't chuck that piece of evidence in the trash. We have to be really mindful that if we find something that doesn't agree with what we're thinking, that we include it as part of our project, either by reassessing our thesis statement or by saying, I found this weird outlier and it's worth noting. Okay, next important question, how will I use this to prove my point? Remember that you need to actually use the primary source material that you're pulling to make a point, not just to illustrate a point. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're using a comic strip. You can't just put the comic strip on your exhibit panel and not talk about it. You have to make it make sense. So you have to explain why it's important that you pulled this piece. How does it prove your point? And then think about how this piece made you feel, right? So if you're reading something and you're like, ooh, that's really sad, or ooh, that makes me so angry, remember that that's bias. And bias, while gets a bad rap, bias is super important for understanding yourself as a historian. So if something makes you feel a strong emotion, think about why. Why are you feeling this way? Why did you have this reaction to this piece? Like I said, take notes now while you're doing your research, so you're not scrambling at the end when you write your annotations. Okay, so what to expect for an in-person archival research day. Read the rules of the archive before you visit. So if you register for the program on October 2nd, I will send you a list of the archive's rules just so you have them. The rules are different everywhere, but there are some kind of general rules that are always in place. No food or drink. You can't bring your backpack into the archive. You have to put it in a locker, or leave it in your car or at the front desk. But really important that you read the rules before you visit the archive. So here's a really good example. The Arizona Historical Society allows you to bring your cell phone into the archive to take pictures for personal use only. If you want to publish those pictures, you have to pay a fee. On the other hand, Charlotte Hall allows no photography at all in their archive. So you want to make sure that you bring your computer, but no paper or pens. Most archives will supply you with a special paper that's acid-free that won't damage the documents in the archive, and it will give you a pencil. Writing implements and priceless documents do not mix. Sometimes they will say if you're handling certain really sensitive materials, they'll give you a set of gloves, or they'll encourage you to take pictures of the pieces instead of having your notes near them. Sometimes they might put you in a totally separate room and you can't bring any note-taking materials. It really just depends on the restrictions of those particular pieces. Note that some personal information may be collected from you. A lot of archives you have to sign in and give contact information in case something goes missing, and they can talk to you about it. Or maybe they just want to add you to their newsletter, who knows? But you will be asked for some personal information sometimes when you go to the archives. Copies of things may cost you. So that's how libraries and archives stay afloat, is by making copies for patrons. So if you want a super professional high-res image of a historical photograph, there might be a fee to do so. Just be aware of that. Like I said, no food or drink. That's kind of universal. No gum, also universal. And then be prepared to make a couple of trips. Most archives are really only open for a couple hours. So if you're going to do archival research in person, you want to make sure that you budget enough time to at least come back 2 or 3 times. There's just so much material, and unless you're like super honed in on what it is you're trying to look at, and you only want to look at one folder in one box, you might need to make a couple visits. Okay, super brief interlude before we talk about online research. The secret code word for the roadmap, if you're following along at home, for this seminar is Wickenburg. So don't forget, if you are completing your roadmap and following along, you will email that to nhdaz@azhs.gov on or before December 1st. And then if you attend 7 of the 9 or 10 workshops that there are, you will get a special treat at the state contest for National History Day students. Okay, what to expect for online research? Online research, in-person research, totally different animals. So you want to make sure that when you're doing online research that you give yourself lots and lots and lots of time, and that you're prepared to go down rabbit holes. Things in history connect in strange and wonderful ways, and sometimes you'll be, knee deep in some Wikipedia articles, and you'll think to yourself, how the heck did I get here? You want to trace that kind of thought path to those sources. That way, if you're trying to replicate your research later, you know exactly where you went. Take notes. I should have just called today's session Take Notes. Take notes. The beautiful thing about doing online research is you can copy and paste URLs or DOIs, which are static URLs. So if the website changes, you can still access that article. Consider making folders of bookmarks in your bookmarks or favorites bar. That way you can organize them in the way that helps your brain understand the materials the best. And then another thing is to remember that sometimes things are behind paywalls. So a really great example is something like newspapers.com or ancestry.com. Sometimes you have to have a subscription to access those materials. So see if your school or local library has that subscription service, already pays for it, and is willing to share the information, the login information with you, or think about creative ways to approach that. So let's say you're trying to look at the 1880 census for Arizona, and you're trying to look at it on ancestry.com and you can't access it. We have the 1880 census for Arizona in our archives. So if you can't access it online, you might be able to access it in person. Okay, so online databases. We already talked a little bit about online databases. And so here are some examples of the very, very many online databases that there are in the world. There's JSTOR, there's the Arizona Historical Society Library and Archives, there's the Digital Arizona Library through the Arizona State Library System, there's the National Archives, there's WorldCat, there's Google Scholar. There are so many different kinds of databases, and these are just the ones that are like super, super, super reputable. There are tons of less reputable online databases that do exist as well. So we'll talk a little bit about how to determine if a source is a good source, but just keep in mind that there are so many different kinds of databases. And the information that you're looking for will dictate the kind of database that you use. Okay, so peer review and the threshold for publishing. The internet is a beautiful tool for democratizing information, but at the same time, that has really lowered the threshold for publication. Anyone can publish literally anything. So it's very important that when we access a source of any kind, that we're incredibly critical of that source. So let's talk a little bit about peer review. So what the heck is peer review? Why do we care so much about peer-reviewed articles? So peer review is when a work of history or science or whatever, sociology, whatever, is reviewed by people in the same field with similar competencies for your peers. When you read a peer-reviewed work, you can be confident that even if this work disagrees with the major ideas in the field, it is still considered to be good, cogent, and full of integrity by other professionals in the field. So basically what that means is when you're accessing a peer-reviewed article, experts in the field agree that this is a good article, regardless of whether, sometimes articles are these like landmark, earth-shattering moments where it's like everything we knew about X event is totally wrong, but they're situated in that conversation that people are having. That's the important thing about history work is history writing, history thinking happens in conversation with other historians. And that's where peer review is going to be so important. So with the internet, like I said, the threshold for publishing is much lower nowadays. Anyone can have a blog. So be aware of pay for publishing scam websites. So some journals will look super reputable, but if you do your research, you'll find that people, paid to have their work published. It's not peer reviewed, or the peers that they selected are not actually their peers. Remember, be critical of everything that you read, especially if you agree with it. I think sometimes we're only critical of the things that we disagree with, but it's very important that we're also critical of the things that we do agree with. Okay, another note about media literacy. We live in a time of alternative facts, which, historians are very aware of the concept of there being alternative facts, this idea that you have evidence and then you have interpretation of evidence, and sometimes those two things line up in interesting ways. So it's really important to remember that everyone and everything has a bias, and that's not a bad thing. Bias is necessary for the historical thinking process. Bias is bad when we don't address it and when we allow our bias to intentionally skew or misinterpret or misconvey evidence. So be critical of all your sources, especially trusted sources like .gov or .edu websites. Like I said, everyone has a bias. And sometimes it's not even bias, right? Sometimes there are rules about what you can and can't share. Sometimes there are rules about the kinds of language that you can use, and that twists the meaning of whatever piece you're reading, even ever so slightly. It does twist the meaning of it, so you need to be aware of those things. Okay, so some online searching tips and tricks. So when you use quotation marks around ideas, you can get more exact results. So John Smith versus John Smith get very different results, right? John Smith is a super generic name. So if you're looking for someone super specific, you want to put quotation marks around their name. You can use the minus sign to filter out results that aren't helpful. So let's say you're doing your project on the Titanic, and every time you Google Titanic, you get 80 gajillion results for the movie. So if you go Titanic minus movie, it'll filter out some of those movie results. And or get different results. So fish and chips is very different from fish or chips. So just be really mindful of the conjunctions you're using, right? So are we looking for two things that have a relationship together, or are we looking for two things that could have a relationship together, but not necessarily always? And then finally, you want to use the tilde to help find synonyms. So a really good example is tilde women might pull up women, girls, females, all kinds of different things. So if you're looking for synonyms, or if there's some debate over historical language on a topic, you want to use the tilde, and that might help get you some more specific results relating to what you're looking for. Okay, now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about correctly citing online images. So historians, particularly historians of Greek and Rome, but I think that this topic has kind of expanded to all historians, believe in this thing. It's this Latin term called ad fontes. And ad fontes means back to the source. So when you're looking at online images in an article, for example, you always want to go back to the original source. All things, even and especially photography and images, have an original source. Track down that original source and cite it. So I'll give a couple examples. So this is a blog post from the Arizona Historical Society blog, which I have here. This is the blog. And we have this picture here. And if we scroll down, we see that there's a citation for this image. It's got an image number, and we know that it's from the Mexican Heritage Project. But we at the Historical Society, we've gone kind of above and beyond. So if you click on the image, it'll take you exactly to where that image is from. And you can see all of the information. You can see which collection it belongs to. You can see the creator. You can see a little bit about the image description. And then if you explore the collection a little bit, it'll teach you a little bit about how the Historical Society got this image, why that matters. All of that stuff is super, super important. So because the Historical Society is run by historians, we're really thoughtful about how we access materials. But sometimes people are less thoughtful about how other viewers can access materials. And I'll show an example. So here is an article from history.com. I think history.com gets a bad rap because of Ancient Aliens, and they should. Ancient Aliens is fun to watch, but a little racist. But all that said, History Channel actually is a big supporter of public history, and they really do. Their historians on staff really do try. It's just a really interesting conversation between what the public wants from history and what historians want from history, and those two things don't always line up. So this is an article from the History Channel about Dia de los Muertos. And we see this image. So if we're doing a research project and we're citing this image, we might be tempted to cite this article, but we shouldn't do that. So if you actually go onto the website, this is just a screen cap of the website, but if you go onto the website, you will find this citation. This is usually enough to write an image citation, particularly in Chicago style. This is usually enough information to write that citation. But I thought it would be an interesting exercise to actually try to track down this image and learn more about it. So what I did was I plugged this image or this text and a description of the image into Google. So I noticed how they misspelled Enrique on the website, and I fixed it for them. So if you look at this, it says Enrique Castro, Getty Images, Dia de los Muertos. And then you see this link to Getty Images. And if you click that link, you get 1,000 pictures. So you have to be really kind of mindful about which one you're looking for. But I found it. So you get this entry from Getty Images. So it talks a little bit about the caption from the photograph. You can learn a little bit more about Enrique and his work. There's information here about how to use the image. So this has some common use rights. So long as you're not publishing it for money, you can use this image. If you want to publish it for money, you have to get in touch with the Getty and work with them about their publishing fees. So there's information about publishing. There's also details about the image, which include when it was added to their website. It's got an image number. It's got the credit. It's got information about the image size, if that's important to you. And so that's kind of an interesting and important thing to think about when we're citing images. We want to make sure that we're going back to where the image actually came from and not citing the source that used it, right? So in this case, instead of citing the History Channel, we would cite Getty Images. So it's really important that we actually go that extra mile and look for those images. A really good way to do that, especially if you have an image like a famous painting or a super famous photograph, A really good way to do that is to use the Google reverse image search. So you would save the image to your computer, and then you would re-upload it to Google, and then Google will scour the internet to try to find the original. A lot of times people are good and they do their homework and they put it in the image caption, but not always. Remember, like I said, the internet is a great democratizing tool, but anyone can use the internet. So we have to be really careful. Okay, so that's all I had about some top note navigating the archives materials. Thinking about the rest of our workshops, like I said, October 2nd is our in-person archives visit day. So if you would like to come look at the archives in person, please register by Monday, the 27th at 5 p.m. If not enough students register, I will just connect you directly to the libraries and you guys can work out a schedule that works for you. And then looking into forward thinking into, wow, what words am I trying to say? Looking forward to additional workshops. We've got an Analyzing Primary Sources workshop on the 16th, project drafting info session where you think about thesis statement, how to actually structure your project, how to weave your argument through your project. November 6th, historical context and student voice. How do you make your project make sense in context, and how do you make it sound like you? And then our last workshop for the fall is going to be the category specific workshops where we're going to talk about rules and evaluations. So if you have any questions, as always, you can email us at nhdaz@azhs.gov. Otherwise, we will see you either in person on the 2nd or back here on the 16th.